name is Jeremy Benstein, and I am one of the founders of the Heschel Center for Sustainability, which is located in Tel Aviv in Israel. I was born in the States, and I grew up there. And after finishing my bachelor's degree at Harvard in a completely unrelated field of linguistics, I ended up moving to Israel. I lived on a kibbutz for 11 years. And it was then that I left and helped found the Heschel Center with my friend, the first director, Elon Schwartz. And I've been working there ever since, doing leadership development and training, promoting sustainability in a variety of ways in Israel. And one of my interests there, or one of my particular paths of connection, has been specifically the kind of cultural, spiritual, ethical, or humanities side of the connection to environmental issues. And after studying for a master's degree in Judaic studies in Israel, I got more involved in sort of the whole question of the intersection between religion in general, Judaism in particular, and sustainability or environmental issues. And so I wrote a book about that, The Way into Judaism and the Environment. And I've been doing that either in writing and teaching, a little bit through the Heschel Center, although the Heschel Center, that isn't really the main focus of the work, but it's obviously, part of it or relevant in different ways. Since then, I've also begun teaching environmental ethics at Tel Aviv University. The Jewish studies or rabbinic literature degree was really kind of a general degree in that whole literature, and then I took it, as a background for looking at, different issues and themes that I've been thinking about in the environment and how that played itself out, or what were the relevant texts, and how do you bring into dialogue a kind of ancient or certainly pre-modern textual tradition with very contemporary kinds of challenges. And so that intrigued me. I think from the very beginning, this is definitely connected to my work at the Heschel Center. From the very beginning, we conceived of this whole environmental thing as very much broader than I think many other people, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to, start a whole new initiative and promote a different way of looking at things. That we're talking about the mid 90s now, in the previous millennium, we saw around us, at least in Israel, bodies that did different kinds of environmental work. Sometimes it would be very narrowly focused on like ecology, like trees and flowers and open spaces, and kind of the natural side, nature protection side. Or for others, it was more like policy issues of how to translate principles of nature preservation or whatever, or public health or whatever be into policy. Or people who were doing or his main approach was, well, it's all technological. If we just, have clean energy and invent the right, environmentally positive tools, then we don't really need to be too critical about anything else, which is, education and values. It's all very messy. Like, let's just get the technology right and everything will fall into place. And so we actually, we sort of have a critique of all of those different approaches, in that we think that the environmental issues of sustainability are kind of like a smoking gun, in the sense of surface issues that are very serious. They're not superficial, but they can't be solved on their own, and they're indications of a deeper problem, or of a more society-wide problem. And that can't be solved just by policy, like top-down government policy, or by technological innovation. And these questions are essentially values questions, because they lead us to look at the root of the environmental issues of resource depletion or pollution or species extinction, and now, of course, the climate crisis, etc., as ones of, well, what kind of society do you want to build? What kind of lives do you want to lead? How do we define quality of life? How do we define progress? And all these things are, in one direction, lead to more cultural, philosophical, ethical discussions, but in the same way, they lead to spiritual and religious discussions, because religions in general, and certainly Judaism, Christianity, etc., have been asking these questions, the same questions from time immemorial. And what I began to discover is that modern secular industrial consumer culture gives one set of answers to those questions, and generally traditional religions as well as tribal cultures and the environmental movement give a different set of answers. And that for me was the connection. I said, oh, a lot of the inspiration and deeper insight into these questions that we're looking for actually exists in religious traditions. We chose to found a center promoting sustainability, and again, sustainability in the broad sense, social, cultural, political, economic, and environmental sustainability, but naming it after Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was known as a religious thinker, a rabbi, a scholar, is also a poet, a philosopher, although he is primarily, if he's known outside of the circles of people who would read his more religiously oriented texts, he was known also as a social and political activist, both very vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. I mean, he died in 1970, so the issues that were very prevalent first in the 50s, then in the 60s, even more so for civil rights, right? The iconic picture of Heschel together with Martin Luther King, et cetera, but his was a voice that tried to sort of reintroduce the question of social engagement and social values as an expression of religiosity, as a spiritual way of life, and so that very much spoke to us. And I guess at the very beginning of the Heschel Center, we did have that vision of sort of a unified thing, like you said, cultural, social, spiritual values together with the faith traditions or the language that they come from, and that spoke very deeply to both Elon and myself. And we did do a lot of them, still do some of that, more vis-a-vis non-Israeli populations. In other words, like Americans who come over and we meet them or teach or do a tour or something, they're very interested in this sort of the Jewish and religious connection to contemporary challenges and issues in Israel, because they see Israel as this, expression of Jewish identity, etc. But as we got more and more involved in working directly with Israeli society, and here it requires a little bit of a sort of familiarity with the nuances of Israeli sociology, it became clear that that combination of things, environmental issues or social critique, together with faith-based language, didn't help us. Like, it didn't fly. It wasn't a good mix for most people. I mean, trying to promote sustainability is hard enough in terms of the different forces pulling in different directions and critiques and pulling people out of their comfort zone in terms of lifestyle critique and all kinds of things like that. And then the Jewish thing is particularly fraught in Israel, both because, first of all, it doesn't necessarily speak to like 20% of the population who are non-Jewish, Christians and Muslims, and others, and also within the Jewish population, there's a fairly kind of deep divide between the Jewish population that would consider itself religious or Orthodox, and then the non-religious or non-Orthodox population that doesn't see itself as reform and conservative and all these American denominations. They see themselves as secular. And that secular identity, and this is changing over the years because there's been a rise of more pluralistic Jewish discourse and people exploring their secular Jewish identity more, et cetera, but at the time, at least, it felt like, they're not interested in specific, like something that's labeled or branded as something specifically Jewish. And so let's work on the sustainability thing, but keep it in its framing of this is a values question, right? This is a deep question of all aspects of our lives, and it's not a technical or policy question. And so that worked in that respect. And occasionally we would integrate, say, Jewish sources as part of that dialogue. But and it definitely worked in our forays into the Orthodox Jewish population, who were definitely looking, and still are, looking for connections between the tradition that is very much a part of their daily life and contemporary challenge. Um, that basically led us in that direction, and then so I'd say yes, we do to a certain degree separate out the faith-based things, or the faith-informed language from a more general cultural, etc. Approach. I mean, a corollary to that is, when you think about especially like interfaith work, and you think in the States, it's very clear that there's Judeo-Christian or Jewish-Christian interaction, of course, now including Islam, because there's a rise of both numerically like Muslims, but also presence and other things. And so you think about this, okay, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and of course you can throw in, if you're talking more globally, Hinduism, Buddhism, et cetera, et cetera. We have the faith traditions. Well, in Israel, interestingly, it doesn't really work like that, because even though you do have obviously Jews and Muslims and Christians, and a few assorted others, but the discourse of intergroup work, I find, is much more not faith-based Jewish, Christian, Muslim, but interethnic, or inter between national ethnic groups. So it's Jewish and Arab, because Arabs, are composed of both Muslims and Christians. And we talk about issues across lines. It's not so much from a religious frame, both because the very religious Jews and the very religious Muslims, at least, are rarely interested in that kind of ecumenical dialogue. But there are plenty of people who are interested in coexistence work. And the coexistence work, and here there is a lot of intercultural dialogue or learning from one another. I didn't go so far when I said my master's degree in Judaic studies, but my doctoral degree is in cultural anthropology, where I looked at joint environmental initiatives between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs inside Israel, and the role of the environment and that kind of work in creating shared citizenship. So on some level, it's a similar thing, but in a very different guise or a different frame. But it definitely, all those issues of difference and learning with and from one another definitely come up in those contexts. In many ways, secular Israeli Jewish culture is still very much infused with history and sources and things like that. I mean, just speaking the Hebrew language, there's so much that comes from biblical and other sources that it's hard to totally divorce it and everything. I mean, for us, one of the things, I'll just give you an example. I mean, we're a fairly small organization, and so much of what we've done or helped promote is also through daughter or sister organizations. So for instance, obviously it's very important for us to have a huge impact, as much as we can anyway, on the educational system, right? To try to integrate education for sustainability in public schools, etc. But very early on, we had a graduate of our program, in fact, the graduate of our first cohort of our leadership program, the sustainability fellows that you mentioned, for whom that was his profession, that was his passion, and he founded a whole network of green schools, which has now 400 schools and 50,000 kids. I mean, it's a massive project, and so we realized, oh, this guy David Dunitz and the Green Network of Schools, they do that. That's what they do. We don't have to do that, or we can work with them, partner with them, etc., to do the work in schools. So that's, by analogy, we had a few years later a graduate, a woman named Einat Kramer, who founded an organization that's called in Hebrew Teva Ivri, which means Hebrew nature. And she basically does this work of kind of connecting Jewish sources. She has a very rich website with tons of materials. She works with all kinds of groups, both secular and religious, et cetera, and said, oh, we don't really, even though we wanted to, we do it sometimes. Einat is now spearheading this whole initiative, and we can support her, partner with her, be a resource for her, etc. I personally sit on her board of directors, so we're definitely part of an ecosystem that does all kinds of things, and so we sort of came to the conclusion we don't have to do it all. it is something that's relevant to every single person, because obviously it's the richer you are, the more economic resources you are, then the more you're implicated, or the more you're deeply involved in this consumer culture. But even people who are more impoverished or economically challenged, they probably don't feel that they're over consuming, or right their use of luxury goods and stuff, but they definitely have the ideal that what they're striving for is that high consumption American lifestyle, and that's what's really unfortunate, because I do think, unfortunately, that a lot of people have this, what's the word? Like they identify quality of life with standard of living. In other words, like when they think about what's my quality of life, well, okay, how rich am I? How many toys do I have? Right, whoever dies with the most toys wins, etc. And think less about spiritual meaning, about being part of communities, about relationships, about the natural world, and the role that plays in how we see our quality of life. So it's definitely one thing that we try to promote. And there I actually do often bring in sources kind of in a more subversive way from religious texts. So, for instance, the 10th commandment out of the 10 commandments is "Thou shalt not covet," right? And so we talk about that with Israeli groups. So, what does coveting mean? I'm sure we can all get behind not murdering and not stealing and stuff, but do we really? Why would this be one of those 10 major values? And is it, does our consumer culture encourage coveting? Does it fan the flames of us wanting more and more and wanting to be like our neighbors or have what our neighbors have? And what does that mean? And is that, what does that mean about our spiritual and psychological health? And so that's definitely part of it. There's no question. And also another thing that we promote regarding consumption is that often, or at least in previous years, the environmental movement has been was made its work easy, or was lazy about okay, we have this problem, we have this critique, what are the solutions? And you just say, oh, well, consume less, or don't buy anything you don't need, tighten your belt, make it do, a voluntary simplicity, that sort of thing. Well, that just doesn't work for most people. I mean, it can be inspiring, and there are definitely like enclaves of people for whom that makes sense, but just to say cut back or buy what you need, I mean, most people think they need most of what they buy. How are you going to decide with a person how many pairs of shoes they need, or how many jeans, or et cetera, et cetera. So that whole need-based thing, or what I call the quantitative approach to consumption, I think is pretty much a non-starter, or isn't a very useful tool in helping people make hard decisions. And so what we've been trying to promote more recently is not so much that the goal, or the thing you sort of try to tackle head on, is not quantitative, not just consume less, but change your patterns of consumption. A byproduct of this is that you will eventually consume less, but change like, for instance, collective consumption. Why does everybody in every house on a block in a well-off neighborhood need a drill, and need 6 suitcases, and need camping equipment, and need like all these things that we buy that ideally we use, but so oftentimes we use them once and put them in the drawer, or we use them once a year because that's how often we need them. And so there's this essentially a whole movement afoot, obviously globally, but also we're trying to encourage that in Israel. Things like libraries of things, right? Why do we just borrow books? Why can't we borrow a drill, or borrow, I don't know, a beard trimming machine, or whatever, all the things. And then you realize that the solution to the consumption problem is not making do with less. The solution to the consumption problem is being part of a community that can help fulfill your physical needs. And once you realize that a lot of the reason why we have overconsumption is not just that whatever, we have extra money and we spend it, because oftentimes people go into debt in order to consume, but because we have these unfulfilled emotional needs that we try to fulfill with material stuff, with possessions, with purchasing power. It's very common to talk about shopping therapy or things like that. And so if you can fulfill those spiritual needs, again, by strengthening communities and strengthening human relationships. And one of the ways to do that is actually to do that by using the communities to fulfill our physical needs. You don't have to buy the stuff, and then you realize, oh, rather than go hang out at the mall, I'll hang out at the community garden where we'll grow some food and meet people and stuff like that. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but of course, but you get the idea that we're trying to promote the solution to consumption is actually community. It's in a whole different level that people might not expect. Consumption is how consumer culture in general makes us into essentially more passive citizens. We end up just, worrying about our own selves, what we have inside our house, and worrying or being active less about what's going on outside the house in communities, societies, cities, government, etc. And I mean, I don't know if that sounds like it makes sense, but I can fill in the details if necessary. And I I mean, I know a lot of people talk about corporate social responsibility and all kinds of things that we should be expecting corporations to do. I don't have too many hopes in that direction, in the sense of at least voluntary work that corporations will do. So much of it is they feel like, oh, we have to burnish our image, and it's window dressing or it's superficial, because the bottom line is the bottom line. The bottom line for corporations is that they're there to make money. I mean, that's how they're structured. And unless we want to try, not through the corporations, but from a legal or political initiative to change that structure, like for instance, the whole idea that corporations have rights, I think is ludicrous and offensive and part of one of the huge injustices of the capitalist system. Corporations aren't people. There's no reason why they should have rights. They're composed of people, of course, but people are not profit maximizing agents in society. People have families and relationships and all kinds of complexities, which is why we talk about why they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that whole language of freedom and rights of people. But corporations are not endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. They're endowed by the government with rights that are absolutely alienable, in the sense that we can change them. And they shouldn't have the right of free speech because they abuse it to maximize their profits, et cetera, et cetera. So all I'm saying is that if it's going to be a top-down solution, it's we the people who have to organize to basically force corporations to do things that might not be in the best interest of those corporations, but is very much in the better interest of the planet and the rest of us out there. So I think that's where it has to change. It has to be political. It has to be, it has to be the bottom up influencing the top down to change. It can be, making corporations more responsible. It can also be just incentivizing good behaviors, right? I mean, in a slightly different but related area, I would love to be able to tell people to, get rid of their cars and use public transportation use private transportation less, use public transportation more. But I can't do that in good faith unless there is really widespread, cheap, and convenient public transportation. And that's not going to happen until we, demand that it happen. So the same kind of things. We should be able to make demands on the kinds of on making it easier for the public to do the right thing. Because if it's hard to do the right thing, then only the crazy people like us tree-hugging environmentalists are going to do the right thing. And we need to make it the default case, whether it be in patterns of consumption and that can be done in a variety of ways, both with carrots, right, of subsidies and other benefits for people, or it can be with sticks, with taxation on environmentally problematic goods, et cetera, et cetera. Anything that isn't really private property, that doesn't belong to some individual or some private body. And so that could be physical things in space, like it could be the atmosphere and the oceans and the pocket park near your house, and the urban streets and the urban landscape and everything else. But it can also be non-physical, like the internet is a commons. The night sky is a commons. And so if there's light pollution in the city, then you don't have your access to that commons. And you can talk about how to manage that better. et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are a whole bunch of examples. And the second you start thinking about this, you're realizing, well, it's more than just this very technical legal definition. It's really a lot of folk tales, for instance, are commons in the sense that they belong to all of us. So most commons are things that we've either inherited from previous generations or are part of the natural world, or things that we create together. And in that respect, they're also kinds of, they're ours by grace, in the sense that we didn't do much to deserve them. They're things that are part of our world, and the second you start thinking about them, then you realize they're really, really significant part of our quality of life, that concept we were talking about before. And sometimes you can think about, like, in a very capitalistic way, if you have two apartments in a building and they're identical inside, but one it fronts the street where it's very noisy, and the other goes to the back, which is like, I don't know, some courtyard or even backing on a natural area. So there'll be a difference in value in those apartments because not of the inside, not the private property part, but because of how the commons impacts that. So I mean, so it's, in some cases it actually is translated into some pricing mechanism. But the problem with the commons and the tragedy of it that Garrett Hart talks about is that most of it is not priced effectively, or most of the way that commons work, if they're not managed by some informal or formal body, then there's kind of this market failure where there is a built-in incentive to actually trash it, I mean, to ruin it. It's basically the story of the climate crisis. The atmosphere is not a well-managed common, certainly wasn't, before, say, Kyoto, still isn't, because the Paris Accords haven't really gotten everything into shape. But when there's no management, then everybody spewed whatever they want, because who cared, right? I mean, at first because, well, it doesn't matter because, it gets diluted in this massive atmosphere, but, we're 9 billion people, and it's no longer just diluted, right? The carbon levels, greenhouse gas levels have been rising. So the same is true of everything, like overfishing in the oceans is an example of a tragedy of the commons, because it's hard to manage that global common. It's our plastic in the oceans, etc. So there, almost every big environmental issue can be looked at through the lens of how we do or don't manage or mismanage the commons. And there's a whole, an economist named Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics for her work on actually studying traditional and other ways of managing different commons and what we can learn from that, what we can apply. So I think it's crucial. It's also not so much part of our vocabulary. Many people are aware of issues about consumption, right? How we relate to all that private property that we buy or don't buy or whatever. Like, consumer culture is something in the public mind, whether people agree with it or don't, or accept critiques or don't. But the commons and its management is not part of public discourse, and so it's less visible. Those issues are less understood, I think, by the wider public. So that makes it all the more important to actually get it out there and make it part of public language. And one of the reasons why I chose to emphasize that in my presentation was because I think that when people, especially from a more Christian frame of reference, think about faith-based, environmental dialogue or issues or solutions or things like that, then you often go to the place of faith. I mean, you talk about faith-based, right? So you talk about spiritual issues, and again, that's very helpful for the consumer critique, because the issues are like more introspective or reflective, like what is our quality of life. But when it comes to the commons, we really need a practical social arrangements, and sometimes it can be legislative solutions, but sometimes it's much more informal about community frameworks that manage whatever commons is relevant to them, et cetera, et cetera. And here I thought that Judaism specifically has a particular role to play, or a very well-developed voice on this issue, because Judaism is much more, I think, than Christianity, and maybe Islam is similar because they have their Sharia, but Judaism has halakha, has Jewish law, which really regulates many areas of life. And until you learn halakha, you really don't know exactly how deep it gets into a person's life. I won't go into some of the more crazy examples, but one of the things it does do is there's a whole tractate of the Talmud that deals with damages or torts, as you would say in like modern legal discourse. And the interesting thing about that, it's not just if I hit you, what damage do I cause? It's often cases where you can cause harm to individuals or to whole publics through the medium of the environment. Whether it be pollution or classic example is you dig a hole and somebody falls into it. So you've done something to the environment that's caused damage to people, and so much of that legislation is very relevant to environmental issues, and in particular to managing the commons, the public space. And so, just the last word of going on about this, but the last word is that so as opposed to, or a correction to Garrett Hardin's very pessimistic approach that it's all a tragedy, right? We all need to knuckle down with with what he called coercion. I mean, we need draconian laws to make sure people don't trash our world. We realize that the commons really, in its best case, functions as a source of abundance and inspiration for creativity and a basis, again, for community life and other life. So there's some people call it the comedy of the commons, in the sense that really trying to maximize the potential benefits and look at it that way, not just as some disaster that we have to prevent from happening. I'm a big believer in environmental pragmatism, and people like Brian Norton, if you know the thinkers associated with that school, but basically saying that part of the problem with the frame of saving the planet and biocentric thought is that it really allows people to disassociate. First of all, anybody who doesn't care, if it doesn't speak to them, like saving the planet, then they say, well, I'm really just worried about people, right? And it also allows people to think, well, these problems aren't our problems, they're not human problems, they're sort of out there. Sometimes I think I even say that, I quote Wendell Berry, who said that, when you use even the phrase just the environmental crisis, it makes people think, well, there's a crisis out there in the environment. But it's not a crisis of the environment. The environment didn't do anything, and so it's we who do it. It's not every environmental problem or environmental crisis is a human problem or a human crisis, and that's important. And so when we focus that and say, well, let's look at how we're impacting human well-being, it's not selfish because we're talking about the entire human race. So we're talking about huge issues of justice. We're talking about, the fact that, yes, it's a disaster for polar bears, but it's also a disaster for hundreds of millions of people who live in low-lying areas and things like that. So I'm not saying not to save the polar bears, but I'm saying if we do our best just to save ourselves, it has to be with the planet. I mean, the idea that we can somehow benefit the human race apart from taking care of the life support system that is the earth that we're embedded in. Right now, I think we look to major corporations to fill our physical needs. And we do a lot less of our own, of what we would do ourselves. And that's in a whole range of ideas. Some people take this, okay, we have to go back to, crafts and artisanal arts and things like that. And that could be true, in the sense that would definitely help if we, it's hard for me to say things that I personally don't implement. I feel a little bit hypocritical. I do not make my own clothes. I do try to buy secondhand clothes and not buy major brands or things that advertise themselves. I say, if Nike wants me to advertise for them, let them pay me for the shoes. Don't charge me for the shoes. It's a whole basket of things. So for some things, it's doing more of our own, and for me, that's more relevant in the area of food, eating less processed and packaged things and making more from raw materials and scratch and stuff like that. For other people, it might be their clothes, it might be toys, it might be things like that. But certainly, the whole idea of secondhand or reusing things in our economy rather than the importance of something being brand new out of the box, out of the packaging, etc. And again, it can be things like trying to think about how we can fulfill our own and each other's needs in the framework of communities. It can be a high-rise apartment, it can be a neighborhood, it can be in a town. I mean, when we think about top-down, I think about federal governments, but those are very distant from the citizen. There's a lot that cities and towns can do by promoting all kinds of things, all kinds of pro-environmental or alternative consumer behavior. There's definitely, there's a lot of talk about the sharing economy, and there are unfortunately, a lot of bad examples of that. Like Airbnb is probably not a great example of how to save the world, whereas couch surfing or some version of that might be. I mean, the more that it becomes monetized and concentrated, the less it's really true sharing. But there are definitely examples of that. Of good examples of how to share, how better to share, and so some of it can be community based, but also some of it has to be promoting trust between people and sharing also with strangers. To the extent that we can create the mechanisms to make that work well for everybody. Well, I think it's important to bring them together because we have both a lot to learn from each other. We have similar sources or similar roots, and so it's interesting. It's important to get different perspectives on that, and both not only to learn from each other about the things that were different, but also to see how much similarity there is. And I think even though many of us look at the world as this giant, secular, industrial, economic, political juggernaut. There and I don't know. I think maybe 19th, earliest 20th century, before World War One, there were plenty of people who thought that religion would just kind of fade away. It wasn't necessary anymore. We've gotten to secular enlightenment, and we're going to bring world peace. And then people realized that it's not, for various reasons. And, we can go into that, but for various reasons, religion is not going to fade away, and it's a very central force in our lives, both personal, communal, as well as more global things. And so, as a force, I think it needs to be directed for good, and it's not automatic. I mean, people who think that, many people work in the religion and environment business sometimes lose sight of the fact that even though we see all those important inspirational things in our traditions, not everybody does, and so many people think that religions are have a great potential to be anti-environmental or to come down on the wrong side of these issues. And so obviously it's very important to to make these voices heard and to try to steer the ship of faith, in a direction that is more sustainable. In some respects, the answer is very straightforward. We're not talking about a very narrow set of issues. We're talking about essentially, in Hebrew, we say olam umla'o, which means the entire world and the fullness thereof. I mean, we're talking about sustainability is really talking about the future of the planet and man and humankind and all these different things. So there's no one profession that is the expert on this. Every single profession has something important to say and also something important to learn about how they can be part of the larger sustainability picture. And it has to cut across geographic lines and all those different lines. I mean, that's one of the things we tried to do in our fellowship is that it was the first time I think that like architects and businessmen and civil activists and whatever the whole array, people from the army, people from the media got together and spent a year together trying to figure out together what is the sustainability thing and then what does it mean for them in their particular areas of activity and expertise. And I think that's the only way to promote sustainability. I can't even imagine any other way that would be effective. I mean, just the interpersonal diversity was a highlight in meeting people. Like, I mean, I'm from Israel, so I don't get to meet so many people like Arabs from surrounding countries. Certainly not from the Gulf states or even from Jordan that much. And so that was amazing. And I have a smattering of knowledge about other faith traditions, but not nearly enough. And so it was fascinating, it was eye-opening to hear like serious scholars from other approaches, basically bringing their voice to the table and talking about their insights and their traditions, and for me to be sharing mine and be a part of that. On some level, in a very personal vein, I mean, I had been involved in this sort of a while back. I met John and Mary Evelyn at one of their first big conferences, again back in like the 90s. And so I was happy to reconnect. And I realized this is something, like I said about the evolution of the work of the Heschel Center, is something we had gotten away from, and it's something that I personally miss, or something that's very personally meaningful to me, and it's a part that's missing in my regular sort of secular work, talking about renewable energies and even other things. I mean, the things that are again value based, but not really connected to that part of my identity. So that, and I very much look forward to continuing to be part of the group or the framework that was set up from that thing, because and I have to say that for me it's also more meaningful. I have been involved in other sort of global interfaith things, but they feel a lot less grounded, I guess I would say. That the fact that this is both interfaith and Middle East, North Africa, made it gave it that bit of reality. It's like we're not talking about the entire globe, which nobody can, you know, wrap your mind around. We're talking about this region that we live in. We have very specific issues, both from the environmental side as well as from the interethnic, interreligious, intercultural side. And so bringing those together, I thought was a great, equation, or a great combination. And so I look forward both to being active in whatever initiatives this actual framework sprouts, but also it got me excited to get back into this thing. And I'm going to a conference in Germany that's also like talking about faith-based connections, and really trying to bring more of that into the work here in Israel, between Jews and Arabs, etc. Well, I think one of the unique contributions that a faith-based approach can have is that everybody is thinking so much really in short term, right? I mean, businesses are committed to a quarterly report or showing profits as quickly as possible, and politicians have to think about their 4-year terms of office, etc. Who's thinking about eternity, right? I think it's us. I think it's people from a faith-based perspective that are thinking about, the long now, as some people call it, that eternity. And so I would say that next to that plaque that says "Think globally, act locally," I would say "Think eternally, act temporally." Right? Let's take the long perspective as our frame. Like we take a global perspective as frame, but we have to act here and now. We have to act temporally, not just think about how everything's going to work out eventually.